Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So I guess I should comment on the Sargon Patreon debacle, although my take on it is going to be a little bit different than probably all the videos you've seen in the past. I want to have a look at this as being the latest incarnation of a long history of tactics used by both the left and the right. But before that, I think it's only appropriate for a video like this to have a trigger warning.
This is an emergency. Please stay on the floor. Lock all doors and find your nearest safe zone. Stay away from elevators and stairwells until further notice.
Okay, now that that's out the way, as I said, I'm looking at this from a historical point of view, so I will be presenting quite a bit of information before I get to the Sargon Patreon part of the video. But rest assured, the information you're about to see is very, very relevant for the arguments I will be making later on. Now, I do have to apologise for some of the clips that you may see. Some are not great quality. They've obviously been taken off VCR recordings from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And therefore are a little bit dodgy, but, you know, realistically we should be glad that we've got them at all. Otherwise, you know, some of these recordings might not exist. Now, the place we're going to start is the 1950s, and we're going to start talking about comic book censorship.
It wasn't the first time that pop culture had been accused of poisoning America's youth. In the 1950s, politicians took aim at a different menace: comic books.
Here seems to be a man with a bloody axe holding a woman's head that has been severed from her body. Do you think that's in good taste?
Yes, sir, I do. For the cover of a horror comic.
The post-World War II boom in horror, crime, and romance comics alarmed psychiatrist Frederick Wortham, who testified at Senate hearings in 1954.
It's my opinion, without any reasonable doubt and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency.
There was just one problem with Wortham's case against comics. He manipulated his research to prove his point. Historian Carol Tilley recently uncovered these distortions, but Wortham had already left his mark on the comic book industry.
The comics publishers in 1954 came together to create the Comics Code Authority, the CCA. Publishers would have to submit their stories and artwork to the Code Authority for approval.
In short, comics have undergone a major facelifting.
There were smaller publishers that chose to go out of business rather than try to comply with the code. It was an industry regulating itself, taking away its provocative edges and dulling them for a very long time.
Now, some of that may seem a little bit familiar. We have very dodgy academic research. Sound familiar? I'm sure it does. We have the threat narrative of we have to save the children. And of course we have pressure on publishers to toe the line to that particular moral panic. But it didn't stop there in the 50s. Let's jump ahead to the 70s, where D&D came under attack.
You're leaving the world of reality into the world of fantasy. It advocated murder, decapitation. And I'm going, this isn't a healthy game. How can it be a healthy game?
That game, and Deer's hunch that Egbert was playing it in the tunnels, made great fodder for headlines, but it was a dead end, and Deer went back to Texas empty-handed.
It wasn't within a day or two that the phone call came in, and I was told where I could find him, that he was still alive. So we flew out, and I'm trying to remember his exact words, but he couldn't really say a lot, and I left it like that.
Egbert was a complicated teenager whose disappearance was never fully explained and who later committed suicide.
There was speculation he was the victim of a campus game called Dungeons and Dragons, but after a month-long nationwide search, he was found unharmed.
Deere fed into the growing suspicions about D&D in a book that pointed to the game as a culprit in Egbert's disappearance. But Tim Kask, who helped develop D&D with Gary Gygax, says Deere was just hyping the story for personal gain.
He was a publicity hound, and he knew that he could hang it on D&D and gather a lot of media frenzy, and he did. Dallas Egbert is a tragic story. Brilliant young man, sent off to university at 15. It had nothing to do with D&D and the steam tunnels.
Still, that attention set off an unexpected chain of events.
Our stock took off, literally. We sold thousands of more copies within 90 days of all that stuff happening, and we were up in print runs. That's when we took off.
Sales nearly quadrupled the year after Egbert disappeared. As the cult game was going mainstream, Dungeons and Dragons generated interest in two conflicting groups, people who wanted to buy it and those who wanted to ban it. And televangelists took on a new crusade.
They are kids like yours, like the ones in your neighborhood. Kids who are turning to darkness because society has shut God out.
Conservative fundamentalist Christian group would see a game that involved satanic figures, evil figures. That would be a source of concern.
Dungeons and Dragons has been called the most effective introduction to the occult in the history of man. It is a fantasy role-playing game that teaches demonology, witchcraft.
Gygax, a religious man himself, was put on the defensive. The company hired psychologist Dr. Joyce Brothers to fend off criticism.
There is good and evil in life. And the way Dungeons and Dragons is set up is that good triumphs over evil.
Tim Kask says that in private, he and Gygax couldn't believe the game was being linked to devil worship.
Without sounding disrespectful at all, we laughed our butts off most of the time. Because it's like, are you kidding me? You really think we're teaching your children demonology?
But the controversy grew after the news media reported that a string of teen murders and suicides had one thing in common. The killers or victims were D&D players.
Mary Towie was killed by two friends, Ron Adcox and Darren Molitor. The crucial point is, can a game create psychosis? Or is someone like Darren Molitor an accident waiting to happen, with or without the game?
If you found 12 kids in murder-suicide with one connecting factor in each of them, wouldn't you question it? And that's all people would do.
I would certainly do it in a scientific manner, and this is as unscientific as you can get. It's nothing but a witch hunt.
So are you starting to see some patterns here? We have the moral panic, and of course we have to protect the children. That's the main goal, always. Which means we have to ban those bad things, those evil things, because, you know, playing Dungeons and Dragons, everyone knows that leads to Satanism, just like watching YouTube videos leads to someone becoming a Nazi, right? And of course the media loves to jump on these bandwagons and fan the flames, especially if there's a killer who just so happens to play Dungeons and Dragons. Then that must be the only cause, not a lifelong history of mental illness or abuse as a child. Of course not. It's because he bought a fucking Dungeons and Dragons game. Does that sound familiar? But of course the moral panic didn't stop there. Apparently there were Satanists just everywhere.
Deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals. Because of the program's theme and controversial subject matter, parental discretion should be exercised.
You have to give a blood sacrifice to Satan. It's supposed to keep you protected. It's supposed to keep you pure.
They said that if we told that the devil would come and kill our parents.
It doesn't matter if you believe in Satan. It doesn't matter if you believe in demons. What's important is to know that there are people out there that do, and they're willing to do anything to accomplish their goal.
Satanism is more than a hodgepodge of mysticism and fantasy.
more than a Halloween motif. It's a violent impulse. It preys on the emotionally vulnerable, especially teenagers, often lonely and lost.
It basically started out like the killing of animals. Then there's always the heavy metal music, and drugs don't help.
It attracts the angry and the powerless, who often sink into secret lives.
They asked me if I had ever thought about killing somebody just to watch them die. And they asked me if I would like to join a satanic cult.
Possessed by an obsessive fascination with sex and drugs, and yes, heavy metal rock and roll. Satan's child. Often Satanism seems to be a personal psychodrama, a kind of license for strange, sometimes violent behavior.
A bloodbath would be a cleansing and a purification of a planet that has been dirtied and degraded for too long.
Sometimes it's just half-baked mumbo-jumbo and scrawled symbols, but other times it goes deeper.
I find it interesting that they include images of graffiti, right? Because that's a clear sign that Satanists are real. You know, kids doing graffiti at whatever possible cause could it be. The present-day equivalent to that, I guess, is a newspaper article using images of comments on Twitter by trolls as if they're serious, you know. Something said by a troll to get attention, to be sarcastic, is treated as if it's real, right? Just like graffiti is a clear sign that Satan is real. I mean, what could be wrong with that logic?
Deadly.
Tommy died as brutally as his mother did, but at his own hands.
I loved him dearly, but he also took my wife who I loved.
Satanism goes far beyond teenage obsession. Today there are cults that worship the devil, engage in secret ceremonies, believe in ancient, though bizarre theology, all of it constitutionally protected, as long as no laws are broken.
I believe that hate is necessary in a controlled way just as much as love is necessary.
The other face of adult Satanism is violent and fiendish, centered on sexual ritual and torture, frequently descending into the vilest crime of all, sexual abuse of children.
So once again we have the "we have to save the children" line. Now, this line is still used today, although it's a little bit different. Today it's we have to protect adults from comments that they may find offensive. Now, I would argue that if you're an adult who has to be protected from a comment that you may find offensive, then you're not really an adult. You're actually just a child. So, we have to protect the children is still used today. And of course, we also see the satanic connection to killers, right? Because everyone knows if you buy an Iron Maiden album, you're going to go out and mass kill people. Oh, hold on. I guess that strategy by Satan isn't really working, is it? Because, most people, the vast majority of people who listen to heavy metal albums never hurt anyone. Damn, those backwards messages they're just not really having that effect. I don't know why. I guess Satan needs to go back to the drawing board. But I have to wonder if the media didn't play up the whole satanic panic thing and these people still went out and killed people, which I assume they would have, would they still be calling themselves Satanists? No. These are mentally ill people which have latched on to whatever is in the media at the time. If the media panic at the time, the moral panic had have been My Little Pony, then I'm sure the serial killers would have been bronies, right? Now, I'm being a little bit sarcastic there, but yeah, it's still possible. That's the world we're presently living in. And of course, the satanic panic was also used to deplatform people and to shut down concerts. Does that sound familiar? Do you see where this might be going?
People running Kemper Arena, which is losing money for the city, may find themselves turning away business. Rock concerts, a Kemper staple, have come under fire by a small religious group. But as Doug Sudoff reports, the group now has the support of at least one city councilman.
Sometimes action at rock concerts moves outside the auditorium, like during Alice Cooper's Kemper Arena show 1 week ago.
Why? 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 Because they put on a show like this?
As we showed you then, parents worried about rock's alleged drug, violence, and satanic impact on the young picketed outside Kemper. Some of those protesters met with Councilman John Sharp this week. Sharp says those 20 or so people want an ordinance establishing a citizens review committee, a committee to screen which rock groups may play at city-run Kemper and municipal auditorium. Rock promoter Chris Fritz calls the idea unconstitutional and sees legal problems.
I think the city would have a hard part because then they'd have lawsuits probably from a lot of bands that they would turn down from discrimination.
Councilman Sharp agrees. The city asks for trouble by banning rock groups. Instead, he wants to use some fine print to control what goes on at rock concerts.
We could require that group to sign a contract that they would not promote illegal activity, and to require them to put up a performance bond which would be forfeitable if they violated.
Sharp asked city staff to review legality of his proposal, hopes for an answer within a month. Meanwhile, the music of groups like Iron Maiden, scheduled for a municipal auditorium concert next month, mean money for city coffers.
It's penny wise and pound foolish to try to make a few bucks off bringing a rock group in that promotes drug use.
But Chris Fritz doubts rock and roll, no matter how gross, leaves America's youth twisted.
It's a show. I mean, it's a lot of this is all make-believe.
Doug Sudoff, Action for Nightcast.
But of course, this particular moral panic didn't stop with heavy metal, Satanism, and the religious right. Oh no, the left got in on this too, and they took it to pop music.
3 decades later, the Washington Wives proposed a code of their own, an explicit lyric warning label, which the industry soon agreed to. But the idea of a warning label worried musicians like Frank Zappa.
They may say, we are not interested in legislation, but there are others who do, and there's this fervor to get in and do even more, even more.
A few years later, Zappa's fears became a reality.
The rap group 2 Live Crew.
In 1990, a federal district court judge in Florida ruled that some of 2 Live Crew's songs were obscene and could not legally be sold or performed in 3 Florida counties.
Yesterday, Fort Lauderdale authorities arrested store owner Charles Freeman. He had refused to stop selling the group's best-selling album, As Nasty as They Wanna Be.
My reaction was, are these people crazy? Adults should be able to listen to whatever they want to listen to.
Group leader Luther Campbell refused to cancel an upcoming concert.
It was important to perform, and exercise my free speech.
Undercover officers who had been hiding in the audience arrested band members Luther Campbell and Chris Wong Wong on charges of violating Florida obscenity laws.
Now, that sounds crazy, right? I mean, it's almost as crazy as arresting someone for teaching their dog to do a Nazi salute.
My girlfriend is always ranting and raving about how cute and adorable her wee dog is, and so I thought I would turn them into the least cute thing that I could think of, which is a Nazi.
Do you want to gas the Jews? Do you want to gas the Jews? Do you want to gas the Jews? Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
Okay, so the next clip is rather long and it is fairly bad quality, so I do apologise for that. But it is watchable. It's from 1990 and it's an Oprah show with Jello Biafra. Now, I don't know if you know who Jello Biafra is. He's the former lead singer of the Dead Kennedys, and he's also been in Lard and a couple of other groups and done a lot of solo stuff. I'm actually a big fan of his music. He is very left-wing, though, and for the record, some of his politics I agree with and some I don't. but, you know, realistically you can say that about most people. But he's talking about a particular thing that happened to him involving censorship and a trial, which I think is quite relevant considering the clip we just saw. And his opponent is Tipper Gore. Now, you should all know who Tipper Gore is. She's the wife of former Vice President and former presidential candidate Al Gore. And it was Tipper in the 80s who started the PMRC, or the Parent Music Resource Center, who were determined to ban all the nasty things and all those nasty pop songs that we had to protect the children from. Once again, we have a small group creating a moral panic and then dictating what others can listen to, watch, or read. Do you see a pattern forming here?
You mentioned young artists expressing themselves. Jello Biafra was taken to court a couple of years ago for the album Frankenchrist by the dead Kennedys.
Well, what we're seeing here is what I see as a false controversy. It's rap music, and rap music is being cast as a Willie Horton poltergeist-type figure in order to advance the agenda of the religious right backers of Tipper Gore's organization, the PMRC. In my case, I can relate to NWA's song about the police because after my record, Frankenchrist, was blasted by Susan Baker and the PMRC in Variety, 2 weeks later, 9 police officers, 3 from LA, 6 from San Francisco, broke a window by my front door, stormed into my house, tore the place apart like you'd see KGB people doing a TV movie or something, went through my address book, page by page, comparing names, and while I sat there on a chair with a bathrobe on with 2 cops with their jackets zipped right up to about here so they might be packing a gun, circling around me like sharks. It was a subtle form of rape in a way. And then after a year, about, 2 months later, charges were filed against my record. A year and a half later, it finally came to trial. 3 weeks sitting in a courtroom in Los Angeles, watching lawyers argue over not just the supposedly explicit insert by an Academy Award-winning artist from Switzerland. My lyrics were put on trial. A huge blow-up was brought in and was gone over by experts line by line. In the end, the jury did not agree with the allegations of the PMRC. They deadlocked 7-5 in favor of acquittal. But after the trial, in a paper called the Metro in Nashville, Tennessee, Tipper Gore was asked about my trial and said, quote, "I'd like to take credit for it. I accuse you of trying to destroy my career and ruin my right to make a living. And for operating as a front for people like Jesse Helms, Phyllis Schlafly, in order to drive the arch-conservative wedge into the mainstream. Rabbi Cooper, if you think Public Enemy's got problems against Jews, wait till you meet the organization endorsed in Tipper Gore's book, like the Back and Control Center. The Back and Control Center is a group of cops from, I believe, Orange County who send manuals to police departments and to parents claiming that, among other things, the Jewish star is a symbol for Satan, that high-top tennis shoes and black clothing can be a sign that your child might be turning to heavy metal and should therefore be deprogrammed. If a kid shoplifts or becomes involved in a gang, then, well, it must be the music's fault. To me, practicing fraud like that to the point where doctors who used your video in a Milwaukee hospital told a kid who came in to be treated for clinical depression that his Iron Maiden T-shirt was the problem. That, to me, is the real child abuse.
Tipper, let you speak.
Thank you. Okay. First of all, that's a very bizarre rendition of what my group is about. We are not right-wing fundamentalists. I happen to be a liberal Democrat. We have 2 coalitions.
Then why do you speak at Phyllis Schlafly functions?
Okay, one at a time.
It's simply not true. I happen to be a liberal Democrat. I work with Republicans and Democrats on this issue. We have one coalition with the National PTA who advanced the idea of record labeling so parents would be alerted when there was graphic material.
I don't know if that helps, though, because I don't know if that helps or hurts, because I think kids, when they see the label, they want it even more.
Okay, but let me finish.
There's something much worse than that, though.
Oprah, he has leveled a lot. He's leveled a lot of charges. We also are supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Why? Why are parents and teachers and doctors concerned about graphic lyrics in young children? There's a reason for that, and there's a reason to, and there's a way to deal with that with respect for freedom. We had nothing to do with the problems that you had. We want to educate people that
credit for
we
my
want to
trial in a
that was
Nashville
not an
newspaper.
accurate quote.
All right, I'll pull it out for you. It's right here.
Have you ever been misquoted by somebody?
What kind of an example are you setting for your own children when you lie on national TV? Right here.
Excuse me.
What about Jello Biafra's obscenity trial? Quote, I mean, I'd like to take credit for it.
But it doesn't mean she said it. Because,
thank
believe
you.
me, because it's written doesn't mean she said it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can. That's right. You can be. I've been misquoted, and I'm sure you've been misquoted before. That is really not the issue. The issue is how do we deal with graphic material, lyrics detailing rape, artwork that shows rape that Guns N' Roses has, when it's marketed aggressively to young children at a time when many of them are at risk in our society. There are many kids that are growing up without a lot of adult guidance. There are many kids that have problems. The National Mental Health Association estimates some 14 million children.
And you think
are
the
at
music
risk.
contributes to more of the problem?
I think the music always sets a tone for a generation.
But
and
this
we
is,
have
this
to be
is the
aware
eternal
of it.
question, though, Tipper. Doesn't the music reflect what's already going on?
It's not the egg. The egg is the conditions in society. The music reflects what happens. It's not the other way around. It's not a chicken.
We're not making up anything that's a fantasy, you see.
I have to reply to Rabbi Cooper. I don't like everything that comes out in music today either. I mean, I don't necessarily even agree with everything on Ice-T's record, but I've collaborated with him on the new album, on the opening track, Freedom of Speech. But say I was a father and my kid brought home something I really, really objected to, like a Skinhead record or a Toy Uzi or even a Guns N' Roses record with those lyrics on it. I would not immediately go crawling to the phone to call the cops or call Tipper Gore. I would not put my kid in a mental hospital for the kind of music they listen to. I would not send them to some deprogramming center, blame it on the music. What I would do is sit down with the kid and say, okay, you spent your own money on this. Why? What does it mean to you? Why do you like it? Is it the tune? Is it the rhythm? Is it that cool bass player? What is it? But, well, let me finish here. Let me finish. But tell me why you like it, and I'll tell you why I don't like it. I think the most evil part of the PMRC and people like Tipper Gore and Jesse Helms is they play on the fears of parents who are too chicken to talk to their own kids.
All right, Tipper.
Look for scapegoats.
I really had it with the association with cops in the right wing. I mean, we work with the National PTA and the American Academy of Pediatrics. We're concerned about children, and as a parent,
Rock and Back in Control. They're all in the back of your book.
Am I going to talk or not?
Okay.
As a parent, and the Parents Music Resource Center recommends that parents talk to kids about these issues, but parents need to know that there's racism and that there's abuse of women in the lyrics and the issues. Parents are busy.
Wow, that does sound awfully familiar. I wonder where I've heard that before.
3 of the featured speakers were professional YouTube misogynists and racists and rape apologists, and just generally
there's racism and that there's abuse of women in the lyrics and the issues.
Awful people with fan bases of similarly awful people, and those 3 people were first on a double bill. Armored Skeptic and Shoe on Head, 2 absolutely vile, disgusting human beings who bully trans people, who promote misogynist, sexist, racist talking points, who are 2 of the most vile, disingenuous, awful people that I can think of. And one of the few people I can think of who is worse than they are is the other person that I'm talking about, who was invited to be a featured speaker at MythCon, which is Carl Benjamin, also known as Sargon of Akkad, one of the most disgusting human beings on the planet, who...
Yeah, Steve claims to be an atheist, but it's amazing how much he has in common with the religious right when it comes to banning people and censorship. Yeah, But anyway, back to that Jello clip. Jello was put on trial for the poster within an album. The poster was done by H.R. Geiger, who you may know from the Alien movie. I can't show you the image here, unfortunately, because I'd probably get a strike from YouTube, even though it's a piece of art. But he was put on trial for obscenity, which is a very subjective term, isn't it? What someone finds obscene or offensive really depends on the individual. I mean, I find people being put on trial in this day and age for obscenity to be obscene. But if I remember correctly, he wasn't the only one put on trial. I think the company that pressed the records was also dragged into the trial and ended up going out of business because they were only a small company, and the lawsuit basically crippled them. Now, that company was only a middleman. They didn't write the songs, or they didn't paint the artwork. They didn't produce the album. They didn't put it together. All they did was press the fucking records. But by targeting a company like that, as well as a smaller artist like Jello, as opposed to Prince or Madonna, what they were hoping to do was to send a message that if you do or say something which we don't like, we the moral minority, we can fuck with your life. Sound familiar? I'm thinking all this sounds pretty fucking familiar. And of course this stuff didn't stop back in the 80s. It's continued right up till modern times. For example,
sociologist Karen Sternheimer studies popular culture. She says neither comic books in the 1950s nor rock music in the 1980s had the impact on children that critics claimed.
It's really difficult to think about the complexities of what actually causes things that we consider to be social problems. So it's easier and much more visible to say, oh, well, these movies right now, or there's video games, or there's music that's really graphically sexual.
Whether or not they're effective, warning labels have become such a part of daily life that, today, it's not just parents who are calling for them.
Some students are calling on professors to implement what are known as trigger warnings, labels used to flag course materials deemed violent or sexually explicit.
A trigger warning or a content warning kind of warns the person that, hey, this is coming up. You're gonna deal with some tricky stuff. Make sure you're ready for it.
In 2014, Bailey Loverin sponsored a student resolution at the University of California's Santa Barbara, calling for trigger warnings on course syllabi to alert students who have had a traumatic experience like sexual abuse.
It's about students that could be suffering from PTSD and not wanting to be triggered in the middle of an 800-person classroom and feeling afraid or feeling completely out of control. Growing up in a society that has all these warnings already, and it's not necessarily an irrational proposal.
Students on several college campuses support trigger warnings, but many professors fear they could limit exposure to ideas, and the proposals have been publicly criticized.
There's such a sort of moral fervor to protecting people from potential emotional harm. It's taking on this edge that I actually think is preventing people from talking to each other.
Even one of the staunchest advocates of labeling thinks this goes too far. But for her, it's a question of who gets to decide.
I don't think labeling is a bad thing. But for curriculum and things, I don't know that the kids get to call the shots.
Okay, so we've spent a fair bit of time going through a lot of information. So let me break it down into 5 easy steps or 5 easy points, just so it's easy to understand. What happens is we start with a group, usually a small group of morally righteous individuals, be they the far religious right or the far social justice left. It doesn't really matter. They believe that they know best for everyone. And this group manufactures a threat narrative. They are the good people, and they have to save people from the evil group, be it Satan or sexual lyrics in music, which might have teenagers having sex or put sexual thoughts into people's heads, because we can't have that. That would be that would probably destroy society. Or be it Nazis or the men's rights movement or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever it is this particular group doesn't like. And once they create this threat narrative, they will blame all of society's ills, or at least the majority of society's ills, on this particular threat narrative. Now, once they create the threat narrative, they need to identify the victim group. Now, this is often the children. We have to save the children. It's also quite often we have to protect the women. But it can also be things like we have to protect minorities like black people. And more recently, it's we have to protect adults from hearing opinions which they may find disagreeable or offensive. Like I said earlier, they're not actually adults. If you can't handle differing opinions, you're a child. I'm sorry, end of story. Now, I should add, just because someone is talking about protecting children or women or whatever group it may be, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. There are legitimate issues and safety concerns affecting children or whatever group. What I'm specifically talking about is when the safety concerns of that particular group are used as propaganda, not as actual concern for the safety of the individuals in that group. Now, once they've identified the victim group that they need to protect, they then have to identify and demonize the evil group, the group which is doing the wrong. You know, the Nazi, Satanic, MRA, incel, white nationalist, neo-Nazi, Trump-supporting, etc., etc., etc. Once this group is identified, they can be blamed for literally anything. And it doesn't hurt if you have some dodgy academic willing to put together some piece of shit argument based on really dodgy statistics or made-up facts. It doesn't matter if it's not real, because this just helps with the next step, which is the media bandwagon. Now, sometimes the media bandwagon is driven by ideologues within the media, but more often than not, it's just the media jumping onto a juicy story and sensationalizing it. After all, you have to sell those newspapers, right? You have to get those clicks. And threatening headlines about the world ending will get people clicking on that website more than saying, the world's really not that bad, or here's some solutions to the problems that we might have. So the media will then spin this. They'll compete with each other to be more extreme in showing how evil this group is, and really they fan the flames and really turn the threat narrative into a blaze. And it's at this point that it usually goes mainstream. Now, if the media can find a serial killer or a spree killer or something which they can somehow associate with the targeted evil group, then it's even more juicy and more sensational. It doesn't matter if that individual has no connection to the targeted group whatsoever, or the connection is flimsy and weak. That's really unimportant. We're not talking about proper journalism based on facts. We're talking about propaganda and selling newspapers here. And normal people who don't know a great deal about Dungeons and Dragons or the men's rights movement or whatever the target group is, suddenly get concerned because they're just hearing one side of the argument. And they think, yeah, maybe YouTube is filled with neo-Nazis who want to kill black people and the Jews. Because, I don't really use YouTube that much. So maybe that's like the majority of the platform. That's what all the media is telling me. So I guess it's true. And unfortunately, most normies aren't all that skeptical to claims in the media. And unfortunately, just not the normies, but people in general. Now, once the media has fanned the flames and the threat narrative has turned into a blaze and the normies have jumped on board and have swallowed it, hook, line and sinker, that's when we move on to step 5, which is censorship and deplatforming. Once you have enough people scared, that's when you can start putting pressure on either venues that might host heavy metal concerts or shops that might sell offensive comics or evil satanic Dungeons and Dragons, or even things like PayPal and Patreon, or for that matter YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc., etc. Now, some of these groups already have a bias, a political leaning, but it's usually pressure from the moral minority who have used the media to fan the flames and create a moral panic amongst the general public that really forces these businesses to bow to pressure or perceived pressure. And that, I think that's a distinctive point, because in most of these cases most people aren't that concerned. It's just the impression that a lot of people are concerned. But these businesses will then bow to that, and they will start to censor or deplatform. And in some cases, the government may also get involved, and maybe they'll start, putting people on trial for teaching their pug tricks, because, that's so morally offensive.
We warned you, or we predicted, and we said that, by the way, it's easy to predict, that once censorship starts and everybody's cool with it, it's not stopping. So when they went after Alex Jones because he's so hated and so vile, which he is, but let's remember what Chomsky says. If you don't stand up for speech that disgusts you, you're not for freedom of speech. That's what this is about. When I was a kid, the ACLU used to defend the Nazis when they would march in Skokie in Chicago, which was a lot of Jewish people in Skokie, so the Nazis liked to march there to piss them off, and the ACLU would defend their right, and we all understood that they weren't defending Nazis, they were defending freedom of speech, because if you can take it away from someone you hate, you can take it away from someone you like. So when this happened with Alex Jones, of course, a bunch of knuckleheads made the stupid, lazy argument, which is also wrong, that you're defending Alex Jones. No one is. We're standing up for a principle. And the principle is called free speech, which is different than freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is ensconced in the First Amendment. Free speech comes out of the Enlightenment, which is an ideal that you're against censorship, no matter if it comes from the government, a religion, or a corporation. And we told you that Facebook is a monopoly, just like YouTube is a monopoly, Google. These are monopolies, and what we should do is break them up. We're not going to do that. So then what we should do is then treat them like a public utility, just like the internet. So you can't just take someone's public utility away from you. You can't, if you're AT&T, you can't just turn off the phone on someone because you don't like what they're saying. But
now the problem with all this is it all comes down to what individuals or individual groups define as offensive. And that is really a very subjective thing. What one person finds offensive, another person has absolutely no fucking issue with. And when you have one group dictating to another group, or the general public, about what they can or can't listen to or watch or interact with, they're really taking on the role of a dictator. And that's a very, very dangerous thing. And a lot of people don't realize this. They may see their opposition being deplatformed and silenced and think, yeah, that's good, because I don't really like those guys. But what they don't realize is if that happens to their opposition, it can also happen to them. If you create a situation where Group A can easily be censored or deplatformed based on a moral panic, then it's just as easy for the tables to turn and for Group B to have the same measures used against them. No one wins in this situation. Everyone loses. Now, free speech is important, but it's not actually free. There is a cost to free speech, and that is, as adults living in society, you may come across opinions which you find offensive or distasteful. That's part of the cost of free speech. But other people may find your opinions offensive or distasteful. And the same freedom of speech which protects you also protects those other people that you may find offensive. It has to work for everyone or it works for no one. And unfortunately, not enough people understand this, including this idiot, whose shoe size, unfortunately, is much higher than his IQ.
Some of the intellectual dark web's biggest icons are getting together to defend Sargon of Akkad, Milo Yiannopoulos, and some other white nationalists who shouldn't even be mentioned, after those people got kicked off of Patreon because these intellectual dark web guys are defenders of freedom of speech, which of course explicitly states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press, and also monthly internet payment processors shall never impinge on a Britbonger's right to make money while harassing female video game journalists. So today, I'm not even going to talk about Milo because who cares about Milo? He's like millions of dollars in debt. So let's talk about why Patreon banned Sargon of Akkad, because Patreon explicitly mentioned that this interview Sargon gave was what crossed the line.
I just can't be bothered to deal with people who treat me like this. It's really annoying. Like, you are acting like a bunch of just so you know. You act like white. Exactly how you describe black people acting is the impression I get dealing with the alt-right. I'm just not in the mood to deal with this kind of disrespect.
Yeah, so that's the one thing he said, and then he said another thing.
Look, you carry on, but don't expect me to then have a debate with one of your why would I bother? Like, why would I bother? You act like an upper-class type now. Maybe you're just acting like a nigger, mate. Have you considered that? Do you think white people act like this? White people are meant to be polite and respectful to one another, and you guys can't even act like white people. It's really, like, amazing to me.
Here you have one single Sargon calling out white nationalists and members of the alt-right by comparing them to N-words, or that they're behaving like N-words, and that white people have more decorum, and that they're polite and respectful. And it seems like a reasonable thing that media companies would probably get upset about, you know? But
well, it all comes down to context, doesn't it? And I think it's pretty clear that Sargon was using their own terminology against them in an attempt to shame them. But this member of the Young Turks isn't really interested in context, right? The Young Turks, they don't do context. It's all about what you say. Context be damned. Except when context does matter, right?
Unfortunately, there have been some serious allegations against someone in the TYT network. His name is Sam Seder. He does the Majority Report. They found an old tweet of his where he tweeted this. He said about Roman Polanski. Remember, of course, there's terrible sexual assault allegations against Roman Polanski. And Seder said, "Don't care regarding Polanski," in a tweet from 2009. "But I hope if my daughter is ever raped, it is by an older, truly talented man with a great sense of mise en scène." Okay, so he not only is part of the TYT network, he's also an employee at MSNBC. He's a contributor for them. And MSNBC said, quote, an insider there to the press, internally, there was disgust over the tweet. Now, here's Seder's defense, which he had on the Majority Report. This smear involves the willful misinterpretation of a tweet that I posted in 2009. I will never be ashamed of criticizing those who would excuse the predation of women or girls, and I certainly won't be quiet about Roy Moore or a conservative movement that would defend his actions so they can get his vote in the Senate. Okay, now, as you see there, he's a former MSNBC contributor because they, in essence, have fired him. So what are we going to do at the TYT network? Sam Seder, you are not fired. Get out of here, man. Are you kidding me? This is an attack by the alt-right, by an absolute, let me be careful with my adjectives here, a bad actor, to say the least, as you're about to see. And he pretends to care about women and rape, and then goes and stirs up the pot. It is incredibly weak and, yes, pathetic of MSNBC of taking this action. Now, look at the tweet. Was he talking about being in favor of Roman Polanski? No, the exact opposite. Really? Because you guys don't understand sarcasm at all?
Here you have one single Sargon calling out white nationalists and members of the alt-right by comparing them to N-words. Or
you guys don't understand sarcasm at all?
Or that they're behaving like N-words and that white people have more decorum and that they're polite and respectful.
In fact, what Sam Seder was doing was attacking other liberals, which the alt-right should be thrilled about, who at the time in 2009 were now beginning to put on some defense of Roman Polanski, and non-liberals as well, of course. Even though he'd done the terrible sexual assault and rape actions and why he fled the country, some people were arguing, well, I mean, but he is such a great director, we should let him back in the country. And that is exactly what Sam Seder was making fun of, saying, no, I don't care that he's a great director. He was accused of rape and very legitimately so legitimate that he ran out of the country and is a wanted fugitive. No, we should not allow him back in.
So it seems context of what someone says does actually matter, except when it's someone you don't like, in which case, you can take things out of context and use it however you want to demonize them. And apparently that's not a double standard. That's just the internet these days, apparently. And both sides do it. Both the left and the right are guilty of this, unfortunately. But one of the other arguments I've heard from people who don't have a problem with Sargon being taken off Patreon is, well, these companies can do whatever they like. They're a private business. They can ban people if they want. I, in fact, heard the same argument about the theatre in Melbourne, which got pressure to not show the Red Pill movie. Well, it's a private business, and if they don't want to show that particular movie, they shouldn't have to. Now, this, of course, ignores the fact that these businesses have received pressure from minority groups who are forcing their moral outrage onto the general public. But I wonder, how far does this argument go, that these businesses should be able to do whatever they want and ban people however they like? If Sargon wanted to buy a plane ticket and fly from England to America, and a particular airline didn't like his politics, should they say, I'm sorry, but you're not flying with us? What if he wanted to eat in a restaurant and someone in the restaurant recognized him from YouTube and hadn't watched any of his videos, but maybe read an article about him online or something and decided that he shouldn't be served in that particular restaurant? What if Sargon went to a cake shop and wanted to buy a cake, and the people in the cake shop refused to sell him a cake because they didn't like his politics? What if that cake was for a gay wedding? Do you see where I'm going with this? If you're going to defend the rights of businesses to exclude people simply because they dislike their politics or their worldview or how they live their life, then you open the floodgates. Fundamentalist Christians can not do business with gay people, right? Alt-righters can ban people from the left, and the left can ban people from the right. Maybe atheists can not do business with Christians. Where exactly do you draw the line? Well, according to some people, you draw the line at people they disagree with. And that's about it. That's as far as their thought process goes, unfortunately. Now, I have to say, just to finish up, I've lost some patrons like everyone else, and I do understand why people have left Patreon. I will say thank you to everyone who's ever given me money on Patreon. It's much appreciated. Whether you've done it for 1 month or you've done it for numerous years, it is really appreciated. It has helped me out a lot. I have spent much of it on alcohol out of need to to numb myself after making many of these videos dealing with many of the shitty topics that I've dealt with. But no, in seriousness, it has helped me a great deal, and it's kept my computer up and running and help me with some other, expenses as well. Not that I'm getting rich from it, but every little bit does help. So thank you to all of you, including you people who have left. I do understand. Hopefully not too many of you will leave, and I am considering opening a new account on Subscribestar, although I want to give it a month or two just to see if it's legit after the debacle this time last year. Now, I will say I've just got a couple of final things to say about YouTube and the way they like to censor things.
Jag svär, och näst jag på precis en stå mister så getting that dark snapping it big first hey och getting doing me up cause we are the way I hope passes the gates gosh need a really rowdy we show me our flex yes some caps there's no we are not ja, kom bestjaan uit ziel, met basma vertig, ja, ziel, we are hier scalp is you see you're speaking cryo you raised ja, dan moet je dan bestjaan uit nooit, ziel, just long boy out, but zeg niet uit, what, step no gas, dit je hebt de worst, ik snap maar nou, je hebt wel nou safe, je hebt wel een beetje verder, basma, dat de hier heb je, ja, specifiek is wat, het is niet af, basma, dat de heroïne, dat de heroïne is, stick up, mijn darm, afdorks, dat de heroïne niet, ja, dat darks,